FBI Special Agent Johnny Grusing spent 25 years investigating psychopaths and serial killers, including some of the most high-profile cases in the country. He helped convict Scott Kimball, aka Hannibal, and aka the Opportunity Killer, for 4 murders in the early 2000s, but strongly suspected that Kimball was the killer of at least a dozen, maybe 20 more people.
He uses situations, circumstances, and people to get his way.
In his new book, The Devil I Knew, Grusing details not only the twists and turns of that case, but more important, the inner workings of the psychopathic mind. This interview only gets better as we get deeper into it, because Grusing doesn't only tell us about the sordid details of Kimball's murders, but we talk about how Kimball's traits are to some degree to be found everywhere in society, especially in the most charming and the most successful people. He tells us how the investigations into a serial killer lets us detect murderers and psychopaths and sadists that are just out there in the general population. And, he also drops this update about a possible resolution to the JonBenet Ramsey case, which, if you know anything about that, it's a huge deal. Thanks so much for being on the show. I really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me, Scott. It's my privilege.
All right. So one thing that's really interesting is like the investigative journalist, that's what I am, and the FBI investigator, we actually have the same job, except that I'm much worse at keeping secrets. And you, when you finish your investigations, sometimes there's actual outputs. People can end up in jail. You actually helped bring a killer to justice. And I think that is it's an amazing thing to be able to do. For those who don't know about him, who is Scott Kimball? What did he do, and how did you know him?
Scott Kimball was an informant for the FBI, and he was active as an informant, I believe, starting in 2001 up in Alaska, and then 2002 in Seattle, and 2002, 2003 in Denver. And he was reporting on murders for hire. Murders for hire, if you've seen Shawshank Redemption, excellent show, but it's that most people in jail don't believe they belong there. Mm-hmm. And Scott was an expert at getting underneath his fellow cellmates' skin and appealing to that sense of injustice. So if you shouldn't be in jail, let me help you get out. Who put you here? And then Scott would redirect the cellmate into thinking that he is the cellmate savior, can get him out of jail and get the cellmate talking. If I were to say Scott's superpower, it is his EQ. He didn't graduate. Sorry about that. I'll turn my radio off. If I could get his superpower, if I could tell you about it, it would be his EQ, his emotional IQ. He can see what people want and need, and he can turn you very quickly into his, what do you want to call it, his puppet, his tool, whatever he wants you to be. So you become clay in his hands. And so he was able to get the cellmate to tell him things about the case, and then Scott would rephrase that to the FBI that the cellmate wanted Scott to go kill people.
All right, but you're burying the lead here, right? So Scott Kimball is not a good manipulator who hung out in jail for a lot. He's a serial killer. Tell me about like the big picture. Who is Scott Kimball for the audience of millions who know something about him?
Scott Kimball operated as a wolf in sheep's clothing for 20 years. He was a serial killer. I believe he started in 1985 with his first kill and killed all the way till 2006. Almost all of that time, he had law enforcement by his side, not only watching what he did, but he was learning on how we investigated murder. And he was using that to his advantage.
And he was convicted on 4 charges of murder, right? 4 counts of murder. But you suspect there's a lot more to it than that.
Yes, Scott, he was convicted on 4 counts. All of those, though, happened between 2003, 2004. Mm-hmm. And again, if you look at the span of not only when we believe he's killing, but when he told me he was killing, it's a 20-year period.
So, people are fascinated with serial killers, right? There's a whole genre of like true crime podcasts and true crime TV shows, and these, people just are obsessed with the fact that somebody would go out there and do this. In your mind, what is it that motivates a person like that?
I don't think Scott was born a serial killer. I think he was born, and this is talking to his mom, his family, those who knew him growing up. I think he was born a manipulator. He knew how to make people think things were true when they weren't. He knew how to lie at an early age. And even in some of his interviews, he did open up and give some interviews after we convicted him, is he's been a con man for years. That's the core of who he is. But because he tricked people for so long growing up into his teenage years, he was then on the outs with everybody, his family, his friends. He had stolen from them, he had cheated them over and over again until he was not welcome anywhere. And I believe that's what drove him to his first killing. And after working Scott, and I worked other cases like him, I saw that people like him, when they steal and take and steal and take over and over again, they become desensitized to you and me as human beings, because all we are is like an ATM to them. And so, because he had been taking for so long, when he first took a human life, I don't think it was that big of a deal to him.
What was the first murder that that you believe he was involved in?
So, yeah, this would be about 5 to 7 years into my investigation of him. Again, I investigated this man for 15 years, 3 very intensely when we were recovering his victims in the mountains and in Utah. And then the next 12 of trying to figure out the breadth of all the people he killed, and finding Jennifer Markham, the one who we were looking for from day one, knew he would never lead us to, but lead us close to. But about 5 to 7 years in, uh, he was telling other inmates that the first time he killed someone, he was on a raft. He said he was around 12, 13 years old. He was in the Boy Scouts. He said, and these are his words. He said, a fat kid fell out of the boat, and he goes, just to see what it was like, I held his head underwater, and nobody knew it, and I killed him. And he told that story multiple times because other inmates, and again, at the core, he's a manipulator. He knew when he told that story in jail that his cellmates would try to trade their check fraud forgery charge to come to me to say, hey, I've got a homicide for you, another one this guy's just claimed he killed. And so when Scott told this story, he knew that I would hear about it. And I did multiple times.
And was this a real, like, were you able to track down who that kid was?
There was no kid. Yeah. So when I say manipulator, the one that I could track back through, because I used and I like the way you worded it at first, that I helped put him in prison for a case this large, this complex. I used the profiling unit. I used the U.S. Attorney's Office, the District Attorney's Office, multiple detectives, our intelligence analysts. So it took 20 to 30 people for us to investigate this man. It was my case, but the bigger it got, the more help I asked for. So our unit in headquarters, the FBI unit, is called VICAP, the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. Anytime Scott would give us clues about what happened, they would run where he had been, who had died or who had disappeared, and give me a list. And they would make a new book for me like yearly, because I was in front of him all the time gathering this information, and he was giving it to cellmates. But when this raft story came out, they sent me that when Scott was 19 years old in Hamilton, Montana, he was part of a death investigation, and it involved his grandma. And he had been on a raft with a girlfriend of his going down the Bitterroot River. And then his grandma and 4 to 5 of her friends were in a bigger raft behind him. And he was able to skirt around a waterfall while grandma and all their friends went over the edge. And her best friend, Frankie Thornton, died. Grandma got her sternum broken from a branch or a tree that was laying across the waterfall. But when I searched back into the why would Scott try to kill grandma and 4 to 5 of her friends? She wouldn't bond him out of jail. He had just got arrested for stealing from a nursery. And so when I say that con man is at the center of him, it's he was stealing and taking. And he was upset at the nursery owner in Hamilton for filing charges against him. And she and a detective had been working because trees had been disappearing left and right from her nursery while he was 19 years old. And since grandma wouldn't bond him out, he decides she must pay. So and if you see those two stories, that's how his mind works of telling the cellmates, I held a kid underwater, killed him just to see what it was like. And what I believe is his first homicide when he was actually 19 years old.
And so then he begins a career of murders. And I think that you said that it was upwards of 20 people is what you suspect he was involved in. What is it that pushes you say that at his core he wants to manipulate people? He's a liar at his nature. How does that escalate to like how different is lying from murder in his brain?
Ooh, that's a good question. Uh, I believe once he killed Frankie Thornton and he saw how law enforcement responded, which he actually pulled Frankie Thornton, her lifeless body, out of the water, started giving her CPR, and the cops come and they say, what a horrible accident. I think that emboldened him to say, I can get away with this stuff. And he had been conning people. It's like going from JV to varsity for him. He just killed someone. He manipulated law enforcement at the scene. And for him, I think it was a thrill. Just like he said to, if you look at again, I try to look, Scott, factually at what he says and what does it mean. So when he's talking to his cellmates, he's saying, I killed someone just to see what it was like. And that's when he puts himself at 12 or 13. But that's what I think he did with Frankie. And that's when he upped his game to himself to say, I can get away with check fraud, forgery, fooling people, but I can also get away with murder. And I think it gave him a thrill.
Was he still active in being a serial killer while he was working as an informant with the FBI with you?
Yes, that is why the FBI investigated him, because normally we don't get involved in homicide investigations. That's your local police department or sheriff's office. But what I found was that when and again, he moved from Alaska to Seattle to Denver inside of prisons, and he starts these murder for hire schemes inside. The girlfriends of cellmates that he was with would disappear as soon as Scott got out. And he was reporting on that at the same time, that the girlfriends were the bad guys and they were trying to go kill people. And so, because of him reporting that to us, there was also an interstate nature. And that's what we have to have for like a kidnapping. If Scott was using cell towers from Colorado to Utah, he was traveling up into Wyoming. So, we had the kidnapping interstate nexus. And it wasn't until 3 years in where we actually had a serial killer case file that I could throw this to, because I was working it as a murder for hire, then a kidnapping, and finally, about 2 or 3 years in, we had a serial killer classification where I could investigate solely under that.
And one of the amazing, I don't want to use the word amazing because it's manipulative and horrible, but one of the things about Kimball and his own evil genius was that he was able to use the FBI to some degree as an accomplice in his murders, right? Because you were bringing him out of jail to go as an informant. That gave him more liberty, more freedom. I think there were payments involved. I think I read that he was being paid. So he is able to like manipulate the entire system to enable this sort of life of crime. How did you realize that was going on?
The FBI only realized that was going on when the dads of 2 daughters who were missing came to my boss's office, and that was in November 2006. Because one of the dads, Jennifer Markham's dad, had been looking for his daughter for 2 years. And he had actually figured out that Scott was our informant, the Denver FBI's informant, and that Scott was last with his daughter. But the agent who was operating Scott, if you have an informant, which we all had informants, that's the way we figure out what's going on in the criminal world. I had them for international theft rings, where it was a group coming up from South America that were robbing jewelers violently, at gunpoint and knife point. And the head guy's wife was my informant, and she would call us when they were coming to town. And so if I didn't have her calling me, we would have never arrested that crew. So they're very valuable for us to have that human component. Um, so how did that happen with Scott? Well, you as an author, I've seen you've written a lot of books and you've gone all over the world. And if you were to go back from the first time you wrote a book, because it was very difficult for me the first time, to all the errors and editing and whatever else, and then probably I think you've written 5 or 6 or more, is by now you know how to do it very well. And that's where Scott was as an informant. And the FBI didn't know that, because local departments in Montana and Seattle, the cops, don't share that he'd been an informant for 10 years when he came to our doorstep. So he knew exactly how law enforcement worked, that we needed his information, and that we would pay him if he could keep crime from happening. He just had to convince us that what he was saying was true. And he was very good at doing that.
Mm-hmm. In your book, you talk about a dark tetrad, which is sadism, Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. And I've heard of the dark triad before, but these are the four things that you've said sort of operate as personality. Tell me more about them, and how common are these traits in the general population?
Those are good questions about the dark tetrad. It used to be triad, but they added, they being the psychologists and even our profilers, added that fourth component, which is sadism, at the bottom, because that's very dangerous. And I've done a lot of teaching and talking because there's so many lessons to learn from Scott. And I think we as investigators have to first recognize those propensities in ourselves before we can look at someone else. So if you address narcissism, it's how much do you have to be the center of attention? And I think we're all on a scale from 1 to 100. And if you're at, and what I tell the high school kids and college kids is, if you're at 50, you're fairly healthy, because you think well about yourself, you think well about others. But Scott kept going. And I believe at the narcissism scale, when you get up to 100, it's a zero-sum game. I think other people actually become worth zero. I think when he first saw Frankie on the side, he didn't see her as a human. He saw her as a tool to get away with murder. And so it was all about Scott and him fooling the authorities and whatever else, and Frankie was worth nothing that day. And I think that just continued. And I think his mom would tell you, his mom was a gold mine for me. And that's a separate talk, is that the mom of someone like Scott, and I've dealt with moms of serial killers, moms of mass attackers, it's like you carve out their soul, because their son became this thing. But then as they put the puzzle pieces together, they're able to articulate as best they can these very small warning signs of Scott. And his mom, Barb, had no idea, of course, that he was killing people, but she knew he was a manipulator. But that narcissism, she would say, was at its core. And so psychopathy, of course, I ask our students, do you think you're born a psychopath or made one? What's your answer to that, Scott?
Oh, it's interesting. I think it can actually be both. My feeling is that there's environmental factors that can push latent things in humans to become more and more psychopathic as they are given reinforcement. But there's also like the genetic gray matter might give us more of a propensity for these things. So I think that it's not just one answer. It's sort of the combined, nature and nurture working together. That's my impression.
Oh, I completely agree. And
Mhm.
Scott was fascinated when we were out in the desert in Utah, especially searching for Jennifer and Leanne. I would watch him as he assessed law enforcement, like someone new would come in front of him, whether it's a sergeant, a lieutenant, a new FBI guy, and he would size them up
Mhm.
and say, okay, I can get into you by this or by that.
Mhm.
And he wouldn't say that out loud, but I would almost watch the gears turning.
Mhm.
And when you say made or born, I believe it's both. And I
Mhm.
think Scott could have actually been a very good investigator.
Mhm.
Had he, I think we all have free will. So even though Scott was born with that propensity to not have much human emotion and to twist and turn things, I think he could have been good at different things. And he's told us he wanted to be law enforcement when he was little, but he couldn't help himself from stealing and taking and stealing and taking. So I think that's really good. I totally agree with your answer. I think it's spot on.
When in the opening of the book, right, you're the very first chapter is you sitting in some sort of car, a police car or whatever it is FBI special agents drive, and he's there and he says to you, hey, why didn't you give me a name? Like Scott Kimball is his name. That's how he's known in the world. But other people get like BTK, and we get Jack the Ripper, and he wanted his own name. And the name that and you asked him, well, what name do you want me to give you? And he said the Opportunity Killer, because I killed people whenever the opportunity showed up. And this led me to this question, is that sometimes when we think about serial killers, especially how they're portrayed in the movies, and I'm thinking like Hannibal in Silence of the Lambs, right? And which Hannibal is also one of the nicknames that he also enjoyed, it seems. Hannibal in the Silence of the Lambs is a guy who is so smart that he plans out his serial killings and the way he does it. And he's very meticulous in like he's like 8 steps ahead of everyone else. Kimball, to me, seems like he's not that kind of psychopath. He's not that kind of genius in the way we think about things, but instead what he is, he's very good at taking the opportunities that are in front of him and then changing the the way people perceive the factors around them to gain an advantage. And I'd liken that to like a chess grandmaster, right? Sometimes they plan three steps ahead, deep mind and those other things, are calculating all the moves that could happen, and they know which one's going to be the most optimal. But the other way to play chess is just to be like, well, if I know if pawns are in this position and the knights are over there, in general, I end up with an advantage and I win. It's called positional chess versus predictive chess. Does this make sense? Is this the sort of person that he is, or is he a genius that really does plan way ahead?
He did some of both.
Okay.
Again, when once I got assigned this case, it was in 2006 after the dads came in. I look at him and see how complex he is. He's in jail up there in Montana, and he's manipulating his wife, his mom, a girlfriend,
Mm-hmm.
anybody that gets on the phone with him. He's already got the captain of the jail thinking that he needs to get out because there's crime in the jail. I mean, again, that's the manipulator at the core. But in the 4 homicides that we looked at, I think you've got some of both of what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
With Casey, the 19-year-old that he made disappear, and again with my case, Scott, all these people disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
So to disappear, hold on just a second.
There he goes. He just disappears right there. He's gone. Since he disappeared, I want to take this short opportunity to tell you about my Substack newsletter. Independent journalism like this is getting harder and harder to keep alive on the internet. This is partially because YouTube demonetizes my channel like over and over again for really dumb reasons. And that some of my most important videos, like this one I did on the Epstein files, have had their ad revenue removed because, and you just can't make this up, talking about Epstein's sexual abuse violates YouTube's policy on pornography. And I think you can understand why it's hard to make a living when talking about reality as a violation of this platform's policies. So I'd love you to consider signing up for my free Substack newsletter, where you get early access to my work before it airs here, and then upgrade to a premium membership where you can help me decide what videos and what subjects I should cover next, and even join my private Discord community. Because remember, while I love that you are able to get access to my work here for free, if people don't pay for journalism, they're not really the customers. This platform treats you as if you're just a product. So let's go see if Johnny's back.
So Scott made people disappear, and to make someone disappear, and I saw what Scott did and I applied it to future people who went missing. You have to have an element of planning, because you will have no witnesses, no crime scene, no body. So with Casey, the 19-year-old, he was dating her mom. He wanted Casey, couldn't have her. She's beautiful. She's not giving him attention. So I go into the book about how Scott took 2 weeks of planning to make her disappear, because what he had to do is cut off all of her life supports so she could disappear. Because you can't disappear when mom's in the scene. You can't disappear when boyfriend's by your side. You can't disappear when you're at work. So for 2 weeks, he starts hacking away at these life supports she has until she's isolated. But he would also do exactly what you're talking about is he knew moves ahead how law enforcement would act. And for his Uncle Terry, when Uncle Terry came to town, he just decided to brazenly shoot him in the back of the head in his own house. Blood everywhere, vomit on the couch, push the couch out front. I mean, he could have taken that same time with Terry, but the manipulative, the con man piece of him said, I want to push myself almost and see if anybody challenges my story. And the story he came in with just preposterous with Terry. Terry won the lottery. Terry met a stripper. Terry moved to Mexico. Terry's embarrassed of his vomit. He would try different ones. It's almost like, a master magician with the red ball of making it disappear and reappear. And it was just ludicrous. And yet everybody, like you said, he knows how people will respond. He knows how law enforcement will respond. And Terry did vanish. All he needed was when some questions got asked a year later, he makes up his own Yahoo account, terrykimball44 at yahoo.com. He sends an email to family. Hey, I'm down here in Mexico with the stripper I talked about, and she doesn't like company, so please don't come by. We're all happy. It is just amazing that put everybody at ease. But yeah, you're right on both. I think if he got centered on, I need this person for myself, I think he was sexually driven for a lot of these female victims. And if he had a relationship with them, he would have to start cutting those ties early because he couldn't be seen as the last one with her. He had to be able to blame someone. But for those opportunities, whether it's the stranger, Uncle Terry was a drifter, where there wasn't those familial or friend ties, he could do exactly what you said. It's like disappeared, and I dare anybody to question me.
How would you define the word sadism?
Enjoying other people's pain, that you derive some sort of pleasure from hurting, or it can be dominating other
Mhm.
people.
And this trait, which really does seem like I mean, as you said, narcissism, to some degree everyone's a little bit narcissistic. Machiavellianism, which is manipulative, to some degree everyone has some level of manipulation in them to get their things. Psychopathy, I don't really. How would you define psychopathy?
Psychopathy, I believe, is, well, you defined it. It's either birth or you tend to gravitate towards it through life. It's you lose the capacity to feel empathy for other people or to
Mhm.
feel emotion in general.
Right. So the combination of these factors, I would say to some degree, it's probably all of us have some level of this in us, right? For all of that, even sadism, sometimes like someone you really don't like, something bad happens to them, and you're like, the Schadenfreude, that's the German word for it. It's like, well, it's sort of cool that guy had that karma came to get him. So we all have to some degree of this. But we've also met people who've um, gone to really high degrees of this. And it's interesting when I read your book about serial killers, which is the worst of the worst. I also have this like playlist on my YouTube channel, which is called The Liars, Cheaters, and Charlatans of the Griftoverse, which are these people who are like oftentimes in like the wellness in space, who lie, cheat, sometimes even steal to promote themselves to the top of social media fame. And I've noticed, and some of these people I've known reasonably well, and I've noticed higher levels of these traits in my personal experience with these people, but they're lauded by society, right? They're like, the society gives them tons of money, tons of attention, and I don't believe they're serial killers. I mean, I guess I don't know, but I don't believe they're serial killers. Um, what is that relationship between sort of like success in the world and horrible crime?
You're exactly right, saying we all have a little bit of that inside of us. And I think the sadism, the manipulative, the Machiavellianism, especially that Machiavellian piece, that can be very good if you're in a position of power, of being able to get what you need done and have people do things that they wouldn't normally do. And then they turn around and go, now, why did I do that? But yeah, again, we look at Scott, when I say we, it's us trying to assess him in the desert of, is he telling us the right thing, or can we find Jennifer? But we're seeing all those traits just day after day coming forward of the manipulation, the sadism of enjoying other people's pain. It's You're right in assessing yourself of saying, when someone else gets bad fortune and you were kind of rooting against them anyway. And if you don't check that in yourself, it's like those other traits. It can just not ratchet up a couple of percentage. So your question on when do you become a dangerous person or not, I think it's if you let those things go unchecked, but you recognize it in yourself. And I think when we recognize it in ourselves, or those around us talk to us to say, really, you let your dog poop on the yard, you didn't pick it up. It's these tiny things, and you change your behavior. Say, no, I shouldn't have done that. I'm going to change. Then you stay at somewhat a healthy level. But for those, if you either don't have people that speak truth to you, or you don't speak any truth to yourself, you can go on any one of these four and start getting up to very unhealthy levels.
One really interesting thing that you said at the beginning of this conversation was that Scott Kimball had lost all of the people who were close to him early on because they realized he was a liar and a manipulator, and they iced him out of their life. How do people learn to do that? And why didn't his reputation follow him? Right? He was able to reinvent himself and still be that horrible manipulative person after people were like, "Ooh, get away from me." Like, how come these things don't pass pass on? Why is it that we are like, "Oh, I'm just going to ice him out of our life," but that does actually a disservice to society until you arrest him and he's actually put in jail for life?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The difficulty for the Kimball family is that they couldn't. They saw him for what he was, whether it's brother or son.
Mm-hmm.
They knew that he was taking from them, but he's always going to be son. So he kept doing it over and over. And I've seen that with, like I said, other moms of people who have done awful things. You're always going to be their child. So even though they knew Scott, they couldn't completely cut themselves off because things still affect them and for the rest of their lives, even when he was killing and taking in his 40s. However, those people that were around him, and I think specifically of, there was a guy named Brett Gamblin I write about. Gamblin met Scott in Montana prison. Once Scott is actually killing down here, being our informant, he needs a sidekick. So he summons Gamblin down. And Brett, he had some issues. He had voices in his head. He was a decent guy who'd been arrested on and off, but Scott was starting to just totally get his claws into him and getting him to do what he needed him to do down here. Brett's girlfriend comes down from Montana. She's around Scott for maybe a day. She's like, something's not right about him. I'm leaving. And so it's those casual associates, sometimes friends, who can distance themselves from people like Scott. I play a 3-minute clip. It's from when Scott first was interviewed by 48 Hours, Harold Dow, after his arrest. And Harold does a tremendous job of interviewing him. And I tell the students in the class, I said, have your antenna up and listen and watch him. And you tell me what's concerning. And he smiles when he shouldn't smile. And he nods when he shouldn't nod, like being a murderer. He's smiling and nodding very slightly. And then when he speaks, he's smiling and trying to take you down this path, but just something's not right about him. But it's like you have to be tuned in to listen ahead of time, because if you're there in front of him, he's watching you, he's mirroring what you're doing. He's very careful to make sure that you're believing him. So I call it having your antenna up. And that's what I say for distancing yourself from someone like him.
At this point, I've dealt with a lot of really unique head cases over the course of my life, and I have a sense when people are lying. It's hard for me to correctly articulate it, but I think that, I mean, you mentioned this in the book, that we have this presumption of innocent till proven guilty, right? We have this, that's the law, right? Until we provide evidence to show that you're guilty, you are innocent. But the problem with a liar is that they use that presumption, that's goodwill of humanity, not only in the legal system, but also, when I meet someone on the street, I'm like, you're probably a good guy or a good girl. Like, I think you're good. And they use that to become something more, something to gain the advantage out of you. And how do we in a society realize that there are horrible people out there who are using all of these psychopathic states, and also not become cynical people? I mean, obviously not everyone's Scott Kimball. I'm not expecting everyone to get serial killed. I think this is a very rare event, but there is something about this where when we know the world has liars, how do we act in it? What's your? I have a take, but what's your take on this?
Yeah, I am close friends, Scott, with two of Kimball's ex-wives. One whom he had children with, one whom he took her daughter. That's Lori, Casey's mom. And I asked them at the end, because my last two chapters, I want to write reflections on people who spent so much time with this dangerous man so we as society could learn from him. And Larissa, the mom of his two children, whom that was ground zero for him on learning how law enforcement responded, because he would abduct her, kidnap her, sexually assault her, and then turn around and take polygraph tests and make it look like she's the crazy one over and over again. You talk about someone who should be jaded, think everybody is, nobody's trustworthy, etc., because she lived through horrors with this man. He tried to kill her through inmates multiple times, etc. And I said, Larissa, what should we take away? And she said, test everything. And she does. I know what she does for a job nowadays. She's contributing. She's speaking into kids' lives. She's a productive member of society. But based upon what happened with her at ground zero with this man, she doesn't take someone's word at face value. And it's not that she thinks everybody's lying, but if it sounds too good to be true, was the second part of it, it probably is. And so those two things were things that I learned from people very close to Scott.
In my experience with very sadistic and manipulative people, I've noticed that when they've tried to manipulate me, they try to offer me the thing that they think that I want most, and they try to. They're like, "Oh, Scott, he wants to be better known in his career. He wants to have more success in his career," and they offer to give me this, and then they also really have loved ripping that away at the last second. And like once I start feeling that manipulation, then I get allergic to them completely. But yeah, this idea of testing people and realizing that not everyone is always on the up and up is, I think, really important. It's something that's missing actually in a lot of the world, because we have this presumption of truth. Now, there's this other question that I have, and I know I have an idea what your answer is going to be, but I have to ask it, okay? Because I'm a journalist in Colorado, and you're an FBI investigator here in Colorado, and Scott Kimball is a very famous murderer, but the most famous murder in Colorado history is the JonBenet Ramsey, and they were both in Boulder City, right? Is there any chance there's a connection between JonBenet Ramsey and Scott Kimball?
I think very little.
Damn it!
And I don't want to totally discount him. This is what I've learned, and I do mention that I believe Scott's at least a person of interest in the Peggy Hetrick murder. Peggy was 1987, so well before JonBenet, but she was up in Fort Collins. A 15-year-old Tim Masters was wrongfully convicted for it. He spent 10 years in prison. But an investigative journalist who I told you is a lot like you. His name's Kevin Vaughn. He's very curious, very intelligent, should have been an FBI agent, just like I think you should have been one after spending some time with you.
I can't keep secrets, man. I can't keep secrets. That's the difference.
Yeah. But if I look at the overall picture of Kimball's victims, again, he wanted to be called the opportunity killer.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see him killing little girls. I see him taking women mostly. I think his anger was at his mom for, in his opinion, leaving him for another partner. And I think he did, most of his violence was towards women. Like, I think he would take women, sadistically assault them, etc., and sometimes display them, most of the time hide them. Mm-hmm. I had some vision into the JonBenet case, and I do think they're going to find someone for that.
Really?
Yeah, I do.
Wait,
but I can't really talk about it here. So
okay. But you think there's a chance that we get a conclusion? So Jean-Benet Ramsey, for the people who don't, we're like, who's this person? Jean-Benet was a child beauty queen. She was very young, like 11 or something like that. Found dead in her basement. Um, like seven on Christmas Eve, 7 hours after she was reported missing, and there was a wackadoodle ransom note that was issued for her death, and it was national news. What was this? 80? What was this? 96? Is that when it happened?
90, yeah, 95, or yeah, the end of 96. You're right, December 96.
So when that's happening, the whole world is amazed by this case, primarily because she's a young white rich child in Boulder County, the sort of a iconic victim, but also the weirdness of that. You're saying that there's that we might actually, probably through DNA evidence, because there was some DNA found at the scene, but this could be concluded in our lifetime.
Yeah, and I know you're a curious person. There's 3 profilers that have a podcast. It's called The Consult,
Hmm.
and they dissect that note in 2 different uh, podcasts. If you look up The Consult and John Benet Ramsey Ransom, you'll find that fascinating.
Okay, so I mean, maybe we're having another psychopath here. All right, so I know that you don't have much time left, so I have one more question, and then we can move on, and people will read your book, The Devil I Knew. Go get it, because it's fascinating. If you like true crime, this is your thing. But what does Kimball's case, researching and being involved in Kimball's case, helped you in your life learn about the mindset, tactics of criminals, but also like where what have you taken away from this investigation in the large context?
A couple of things. If you're an investigator, Scott and I talk about this. He, again, not only is he a con man and manipulator, but Lori, the mom of Casey, the one that he took, describes him very well to me. And this was in our first interview. She said, when Scott is with you, it's like he sucks all your energy away. And she said it's like turning on a light switch in the room to where he is just on. And he didn't need sleep. He's told me, and I believe it's true, that he said I could go for 20 hours a day without sleep and only need 4, and then he's totally recharged. So uncanny energy that he would take from you. And he would then, whoever he's in front of, he will test your patience and see if you challenge his narcissistic need. I would tell other investigators, you have to let him win first for the first 5 or 10 minutes, because he's going to probe and test and probe. Why are you here? Why are you wearing that shirt? Why is your shirt not buttoned? Boom, boom. And he would just look and he would insult things about you to see how you would respond. And then as long as he feels comfortable, then it's almost like a dog circling around and around and around, and then they'll finally lay down. Uh, but I had to let Scott win for 10, 15 minutes every time. And then I could do a 4, 6, 10 hour interview with him. But if I didn't set myself aside, and if he would say, I need a new TV, you promised me that I would have a different cellmate, which I didn't, but he would couch it like that. You lied on your affidavit, Grusing. Tell me about why you lied. And it was just, and then I would treat him like I would like to be treated. Say, Scott, I said this. If you need to, I said, I'm happy for you to correct my affidavit. Tell me what I should say. But I'm not defensive and I'm not talking down to him. But that template, Scott worked for a stepmom who had killed her 11-year-old brutally. And instead of getting in her face, pointing her finger at her, it's just letting her win for the first 10, 15 minutes and allowing that person who might be facing something, life in prison, whatever, to talk to the person who has all the information in the case. And guess what? We start forming a relationship. And I would talk with people who had done awful things. Like I spent all these years with Scott. I heard one person, I'm sure you've had this because you've written a lot more than I have. I was walking into a library the other day and I heard one person talking about my book before they knew who I
Oh,
was walking in.
amazing! I love that experience.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's like, I don't want to hear what you're saying.
yeah.
But he said, I could only read about that Scott Kimball guy for so long because he just infuriates me and I had to put the book down. And I'm like, good, then I'm communicating what it was like to be around this man. But the valuable lesson he taught me is that me as an investigator, I had to set myself aside, my pride aside, and just listen to people and be patient. And however much they wanted to attack me, that's fine. Do what you need to do. I want to stay in the room with you because you're the only one who knows where Gannon is, where Leanne is, where any of the victims that I'm looking for. If I can start a dialogue with that person, and it's not about me winning, it's not about me being the FBI showing them, it's about them thinking that I'm not a threat, that they can talk to me. And then it's called the collaborative interview. And that's where our profiling unit is pushing the FBI now. It's instead of this one way, I'm the one asking the questions, it's puzzle pieces, and we're trading them with our offender. And it's not traditional law enforcement, right? But it's like I would actually hand Scott some evidence in his case and say, "Tell me about this." And then, yes, that puts me somewhat at a disadvantage, but it keeps him talking.
Yeah, no, it sounds like investigative journalism and FBI investigating have a lot of spiritual connections. Because when I've interviewed like mob bosses, for instance, and I met this guy in Bangalore, the guy wrote this big article for Wired called "The Godfather of Bangalore," and I was meeting the guy who had shot the person in a courtroom, literally, and got away with it. Different laws, different legal system. And I would ask these, and had killed a bunch of people, and I asked him, "Why is it that you are necessary for this society? Why do you have to do what you have to do?" And so I played to his ego, and he just told me everything. And you're right. Like, let them win, feed that thing, and then you get back information. And I need to be mindful of your time because I know you have to run. This is a fascinating conversation. Maybe we can do it again sometime because I think you've got probably 25 years of stories to tell. And thank you so much for being on the show, everyone. Johnny Grusing, The Devil I Knew. Go pick it up. It's a good book. There's links down there in the description. And thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Scott. It was a pleasure meeting you the other day. I look forward to reading some of your books as well, especially the one about the cold and the ice.
Aha!
That looks really intriguing.
The guy behind that, he hits some of these traits in there. So
Really?
yeah, I have some updates on that book. So you'll be fascinated. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, and just before we sign off, remember my Substack newsletter, early access. Keep great journalism alive. From Foxtopus Inc. in Denver, Colorado, this was Scott Carney Investigates. Thank you so much to my supporters here on Patreon and on Substack and even on YouTube who make this work possible. It means the world to me that you're here. And if you want to get your name on the honor roll, all you need to do is sign up at the links down below. From Foxtopus Inc. in Denver, Colorado, this was Scott Carney Investigates.